Hello, I'm Moni Vargas, the Creative and Program Director at Breakthrough, a nonprofit culture change organization that uses media, arts, and tech to promote human rights. Welcome to Breakthrough Spotlight, our weekly video and podcast series featuring conversations with community leaders, activists, artists, and partner organizations working to build a world that is more equitable, inclusive, and sustainable for all. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome to Breakthrough Spotlight. I'm Priya, and I lead community partnerships at Breakthrough. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Veda Kamra and Azadi Khan, who are advocates for gender justice with Sakhi for South Asian women. Sakhi is actually putting on an amazing event in just a couple of days. It's the 5th annual Gender Justice in the Arts Showcase, and we're delighted to be here in conversation with you in anticipation of this event. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Yeah. This year, the event is centered on a theme of radical imagination, which is something that really captured our attention, and it's very much in line with Breakthrough's own ethos. I'm wondering, what does that mean for you?
I'm really fascinated by imagination because I think that this is a skill that we actually need to practice. And when we think about it as a childlike thing, but really the childlike quality is something to admire. It's that plasticity that allows us to learn and unlearn that we can really draw from. And there's truly a lot of lucidity that comes through imagination, because I would say that it's an expression of our innermost feelings that we're sharing with the world. And in addition to that, when I think of radical imagination, immediately I think of radical intimacy, which to me means breaking down normal barriers of what's polite, what's the right thing to say in conversation, and being more vulnerable with one another and practicing a more radical form of connection with one another that's more empathetic and comes from a place of love. So when I think about radical imagination in correlation to that, I think about radical imagination as the foundation that we can build collectively to think of a better future and imagine a better future. And that, to me, is an inherently political act. I think that this event in general, gender justice in the arts, bridges arts and activism in this beautiful way. And this theme, radical imagination, really draws out that intention and allows us to share that practice with one another. And I'm really excited because we're featuring a wonderful slew of artists who, in my opinion, do this gorgeously. And share this practice with us of imagining a better future together. And, to borrow from Toni Morrison, when you imagine, the challenge is to make the familiar strange. And for me, that's what radical imagination means. It's a political way of thinking outside the box to imagine a better future.
And that couldn't be more timely right now as we're reimagining our world under a global pandemic, amid a national and a global reckoning on racial injustice and what it means to be actively anti-racist. Radical imagination is something that should be pulsating through all of our bodies. So thank you for introducing that as, as a framework for this amazing event. And we're really interested in learning more about the artists that you have lined up. So who are some of the people whose work you're excited to feature? What kind of art do they do?
We're really excited about it too. We got a lot of really great applications, and this is also our first time doing this virtually, so I think we were able to kind of diversify that pool, so to speak. Actually, Azadi is going to be opening the entire showcase with a grounding meditation, and then we'll be closing with an affirmation meditation. And then in the middle, we have a promo music video that's being premiered here. The director of that video is Sanina Batul. Their core inspiration is drawing out an inner self through drag. Exploring an alter ego is the word that they use. And it's a really short and snappy video that's just beautifully shot. So that's one that I'm really excited for. We have a tabla player who's incredible, and her name is Anita Katakar, and she's performing a piece for us and actually giving a little bit of instruction, which I love, about what the beat means, what the intention behind what she's saying is, and the story behind it. And then we have someone named Aida Sidi, who's a social work student, who wrote this beautiful spoken and perform this beautiful spoken word piece that touches on grief and loss and queerness and identity through that piece, and has created this graphic to go along with it. So hopefully that gives you a taste of what's coming. But I think we're really excited to share these all together. It's such a diverse mixture that we're putting together that really explores identity and explore imagination through music and new vantage points and all of these explorative fields. So yeah,
that's really exciting. And you mentioned a couple of the artists' names, and just worth noting that Sakhi's community is a South Asian community in the United States. And so it's really fantastic the ways that you really uplift the perspectives, the artistry, the activism, and the lived experiences of people across South Asian communities. And of course, there's a ton of diversity there. And Azadi, you work very closely on the side of Sakhi's service provision, working with survivors of gender-based violence. Not only women, but their families, and looking at intergenerational trauma as well. So I would love to learn a little bit more from you about the programming that Sakhi offers and has offered for the last 30 years, both in terms of advocacy and technical support, psychosocial support.
There's a couple different components of Sakhi's programming that I want to make sure that I highlight. So the first is direct services. And what happens in direct services is that we have 3 advocates, and hopefully we'll be onboarding a 4th soon. These folks are sort of like the front line, right? When you call the Sakhi hotline, you speak to a Sakhi advocate. They're available through a phone number, they're available over email, and recently we also added text. So folks are able to have their initial contact with Sakhi through that direct service program. These are the folks that then also are able to provide crisis counseling and safety planning. So if you're in immediate danger, what things do you need to consider? For example, having your passport with you, or copies of important documents, right? In the event that you need to leave quickly, where do you go? Who do you call? That kind of crisis counseling and safety planning. These direct service advocates are also able to refer folks to our legal partners, and also our medical partners, folks that are able to provide medical assistance and legal assistance at a very low cost, if not for free. And then basically all of the basic needs are first inquired about by the direct service team. Housing, food, shelter. But then there's this other layer, right, of empowerment. And that's something that the rest of the team kind of comes into the fore with. When someone has their sort of basic needs met, how do we engage this person in becoming financially independent from potentially abusive partners or other sort of abusive folks in their life? So the economic empowerment program, that's the main purpose of that program. They provide job training, resume building. They have some grants for any educational pursuits that someone might have, and financial literacy also, just sort of basic, what is a bank account? How do you open up a bank account? How do you budget? Things that, are not necessarily always shared with women or thought, or other folks who are gender minority, folks who've had their agency taken away from them historically. And so our economic empowerment team really does a lot of work in that way. They're sort of the next step that a client might go through in terms of self-determination. And then we also have the youth program. That's the major sort of my major contribution to Sakhi. It's currently growing. We used to do primarily just youth leadership, which is in partnership with 2 schools in the city, where we engage students in conversations around healthy relationships, boundaries, sexual health. Again, topics that are traditionally very taboo and still are very taboo. and doing that in a way that's very culturally humilitous. So recognizing that these are difficult conversations to have, and noticing that, like, what that is like in a South Asian context, what it's like to be the child of immigrants or to be an immigrant yourself, and start having these conversations, struggling with like values that you country and values picking up in this new country, how to incorporate those values, and the process of building relationships in that in that immigrant experience. So that was primarily initially what we were doing through the youth program. We recently added a mental health counseling component to the youth program, and soon we'll be able to meet with youth survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. Which also brings me to the counseling part of our program overall. We also have mental health counseling available to adult survivors. Our counselor addresses all kinds of issues that might come up for our survivors, everything from things that are more easily diagnosed, like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, to just overall trauma, and the experiences of trauma, and doing that in a way, again, that recognizes the fact that this is another area of mental health that we don't necessarily have the language for. In Urdu and Hindi and these other South Asian languages, how do you talk about mental health? That's something that our team is really heavily working on constantly on a daily in a daily way. And then lastly, there's the community outreach aspect of what we do. And this involves the advocacy that you mentioned. It involves talking to community leaders on every level, local, state, federal. It involves partnerships with other organizations in the community who are doing great work. It involves even just sort of volunteer training, right? How do we expand this work outside of Sakhi? How do we engage everyday folks who are interested in ending gender-based violence?
It's such a nuanced, layered model that you have. Really a holistic model of care and interventions. And the fact that you're doing it in such a culturally resonant way, with such attention to what people are bringing to, these conversations, these very tricky, as you said, sometimes taboo conversations, in crossing the threshold to seek Sakhi's support, and the fact that you're offering it so gently and thoroughly, and in the languages that people speak, in the mediums, diverse mediums, whether they're through direct services or through youth leadership, or through artivism, like with gender justice in the arts. It's such a fantastic model, and it's a testament to the work that you've been around for 3 decades now. So thank you for giving us an insight into how it all works behind the scenes. I'm sure that the work has evolved though right now. I mean, everything is shifting, and so many organizations are having to pivot from in-person work to digital work. And I'm wondering, in a time of COVID-19, what does it look like to continue Sakhi's programming? How have you had to shift in ways maybe both negative and positive?
There's been quite a bit, as you mentioned, that has had to change. For one, we're 100% remote at the moment. There are some programs that are still semi-available in person. For example, the food justice program. We had a pantry in the office of food available for our clients, and it was constantly available and restocked. And it became apparent that once the pandemic hit, we couldn't keep our offices open. And so the team quickly figured out a system to deliver food baskets to clients. So that was I think when I first heard about the changes that were happening at Sakhi, that was the first thing that I heard about. But since then, we really have been able to shift almost everything to being 100% remote. And it has really expanded our understanding of our reach. I think that was something that even today, in a meeting today, we were talking about how one of our advocates was able to assist someone in Houston, right? In finding legal referrals, in finding connection and community. And so I think it's really expanding our imagination, speaking of what's possible with Sakhi and of what collaborations are possible nationally and internationally. So that's sort of the positive aspect of this. There are quite a few negative impacts. I think, especially for survivors, you know, initially when the pandemic hit and the lockdown happened, we saw a 50% drop in calls. And we immediately sort of had a sense of why that was. You know, there's a huge restriction of the freedom of movement. There's a lack of privacy and a lack of agency that comes along with that. I mean, you are quite literally confined to your home. Whereas before, you know, there might have been moments as a survivor, there might have been moments in which you could leave the house. There might have been moments in which you could take a phone call and have privacy to be able to take that phone call. And so that was initially very frightening for us. It changed the way that I think that we have been able to do safety planning also, right? And I think with the text line and with email now being available too, these were these alternatives that allowed for continued safety planning and crisis counseling in a way that's quiet, in a way that's less obvious. And we continue to explore options with various community partners on different ways that folks can access our resources, whether that's a website that is disguised as like a shopping, a shopping website, and you can sort of like have a little corner of the screen to yourself where you can communicate with an advocate. That's something that we're looking into. Or, are there ways in which we might be able to provide programming outdoors or something? I mean, these are all things that are part of the conversation. And with schools reopening, that's also going to be something, another avenue of potential opportunity. But other effects, unemployment is huge. And with job training, we're trying to figure out how to shift that online. What opportunities can we offer to folks who are learning English as a second language? We do have an ESL program that has now recently become online. That'll be super helpful in like assisting people in finding jobs. Other negative impacts are with housing and rental assistance. It's related to unemployment. There's, along with being isolated in your apartment, it's also just harder to access housing outside of your home. If you decide to leave, where are you going to go? Those are some major challenges that we're working through. We have been able to assist people with their rent. We've been able to provide cash assistance, and also as part of the youth program, I'm able to sort of assist with parenting, because that's also another huge part of this, is like you're also stuck at home with your children 24/7. So that's something that the program is working on. But one major gap that I think is at the forefront of my mind is health and safety. Many of our clients are based in Queens, the epicenter of the epicenter. And it has become apparent during this pandemic that there's a huge disparity in terms of COVID cases in the city. And I'm very curious, I think we all are, as a service agency, we're curious about the reasons for this disparity and how to address that disparity. Some things that are coming up is that there is a lack of competency about South Asian health, right? Is this something that is actually bodily? So much medical research favors the white population in the United States. So how do we address that gap? Another gap is just general access to healthcare for folks who are documented, undocumented, folks who are survivors who might be more isolated. So these are the challenges, and again, we're working through them. But yeah, it's again very radical, and is definitely pushing our imaginative capacity.
Yeah, it's a time of crisis, and it does require that regrouping on multiple fronts, as you say. And it's something that advocates of gender justice and survivor rights and survivor well-being were sounding the alarm on very, very early in the pandemic, is this shadow pandemic, as UN Women has termed it, of intimate partner violence, and what it looks like to advocate for people who are survivors under the current constraints, and very real fear that people are living with, compounded by their lived experiences of violence, of course, but the fear generated by the pandemic, and then what happens, economically in a home when there's loss of income, and how that exacerbates these cycles. So I can only imagine how intense the conversations must be internally as you really try to strategize about how to be the most effective partner to your clients amid all of this. It's something that Breakthrough has been thinking about as well, especially given that our work in India is very oriented toward eradicating gender-based violence. And so sharing resources, including the resources of our partner organizations, was a priority for us from day one in the pandemic. So, I can only wish you all the best as you figure out ways to be radically imaginative in this current landscape. And I also want to take this opportunity to kind of step back and talk about what imagination looks like, for the long term. We work in organizations that really advocate for gender justice. Veda, I'm wondering, what do you think, and I'm sure there are different perspectives within the survivor community, but what does gender justice look like for survivors?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I think it could not be asked often enough, so I'm glad it comes up here. I think in general, the simplest answer is self-determination, the ability to imagine one's own future, and then the ability to capitalize on that imaginative quality and access it and achieve it for yourself. And I say that also understanding that we're a survivor-centered and a survivor-led organization. And that means that we're here to support survivors' needs and desires. We stand by their decisions, we honor their decisions, and we work with them to find out and figure out and access what works best for them. So for me, that's what survivor justice means. It means self-determination.
That's such a powerful word, and one that we should be using more and more. I think we're struggling right now because we feel like the ways we would like to be self-determined are constrained. But I think once we reorient ourselves to what we can imagine, what a transformation in our world could look like, then it frees us to really feel that self-determination is possible, and it's there, it's at our fingertips. Azadi, wondering if you want to add anything else to that.
Sure. I concur with what Veda is saying. I think that's something that has always struck me about Sakhi, back when I was an intern also. I think self-determination to to its ends, which can be challenging. Wanting to say this is what you do in order to be safe, but that's not, that's just another person telling the survivor what to do. And it's a lot of internal work that I have done I did as an intern, and I've been doing at Sakhi, and it's something that the team really very much believes in, is don't take the agency away from somebody whose agency has often been taken away or denied to them. So I could not agree more with what Veda is saying. I also think that means recognizing our own agency to end gender-based violence. I really think it takes every single person, people often powerless when they see something that's so huge and so systemic and worldwide. I mean, it can be overwhelming, but to recognize where you hold power, to recognize the opportunities that might present themselves for your agency to really take hold. Where are your spheres of influence? And it takes a whole community to address a gender-based violence. And so humility, being able to recognize that we're all part of this, openness to feedback, willingness to change, and then the action of enacting change.
That's so beautifully said, Azadi.
Thanks.
And one thing that I would also that made me think of, coming full circle almost, coming back to that idea of imagining, this is a collective process, right? In addition to obviously advocating for ourselves as service providers, this is also, to Azadi's point, what they just said about it takes a village or a community to end gender-based violence. We're each responsible for this, and we're each involved in imagining what our future will look like. And there are a lot of barriers. One of the barriers that Azadi was mentioning earlier was the language barrier, the cultural barrier, but also language comes in many forms. You and I might both speak English, we might both speak Hindi, we might both speak Bangla, but that doesn't mean that we're actually speaking the same language. We may be coming from totally different places. So imagination, to me, allows us the ability to suspend our disbelief and see beyond that, to understand what other people are seeing and believing in the world, and to build together in that way. It's a tool for empathy in that way. And so I think, to kind of circle back to what Azadi was saying, we use these tools of imagination, of empathy, of leaning into being radical with one another and radically intimate with one another in order to end gender-based violence, in order to support the survivors in our community, and in order to support just one another in general.
Yeah, and just to add to that, right, that such a huge part of that is being able to ask for help. I think that's something I personally struggle with, and something that care providers can struggle with, I think. And so, yeah, recognizing that maybe, this isn't easy, definitely, and we all need help doing it, but we can work together to do that.
Absolutely. Your passion for the work that you do and conviction in the possibility of transformation is really inspiring. So I hope that a lot of people are going to tune in to the event on Saturday. I also hope that they follow Sakhi's work online. Where can we find you, Veda?
You can find us on the Sakhi website, which is sakhi.org. And we have a specific website for gender justice in the arts where you can find the live stream. You can also find it on our Facebook Live page, which is just Sakhi NY. And you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We'll be there. And we're really excited to have everyone in the audience. So thanks so much.
Yeah, we definitely hope a lot of people tune in. This is the first edition that will be fully virtual. So that's exciting. And hopefully next year, you'll be able to bring it back to the intimate in-person space that it usually is. But I'm sure there'll be a lot of magic in the room, in the virtual room. So everyone should try and be in that room. We thank you all for tuning in to Breakthrough Spotlight. And we hope that you will join us not only at the Sakhi Showcase on Saturday, Gender Justice in the Arts, but also for our next episodes of Breakthrough Spotlight. We'll have another one coming to you next week.